David, in trying to understand free will, why should I be talking to a philosopher of religion?
Well, free will is a big question in theology, of course, for a number of reasons. Theologians, of course, are human beings and have the same sorts of interests in free will as other human beings do. But in addition, there's some other issues. When you bring God into the mix, one rather significant issue is that according to traditional religious belief, death isn't the end. Something happens afterwards, which is usually conceived of as some kind of reward and some kind of punishment. And so ordinary concerns about the conditions under which one could merit reward and punishment, this worldly rewards and punishment, just get ratcheted up to the nth degree when you have to bring heaven and hell into it. In fact, some...
which relate to free will, because theoretically the reward and punishment have to do with some kind of a moral judgment of our moral responsibility,
Exactly.
which relates to free will.
Exactly. Yeah. Interestingly, some atheistic philosophers who work on free will have even conceptualized the sort of free will that they're interested in trying to nail down and then perhaps reduce away as heaven and hell responsibility. That the kind of free will we hope we have is the kind of free will such that it would make sense to suppose that one could be open to sort of eternal reward or punishment. Of course, you don't have to believe that there's such a thing.
So they're using that as a tool to push the argument to a significant level by as a thought experiment.
Exactly.
Even though they don't believe it.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, of course, there are many theologians who don't believe in free will. One of the interesting things I found out when I started hanging out with theologians. All my training is in philosophy. I never went to seminary, but I do moonlight at a seminary. Is that Christian philosophers tend almost overwhelmingly to be libertarians, theologically Arminians versus Calvinists. Theologians tend overwhelmingly to be Calvinists.
In other words, believing in predestination for the Calvinists, that we really have no free will, that God determined everything.
Exactly.
Whereas the Libertarians demand free will in an open sense, that we can make a decision now and have a choice at any moment to do not something that was predetermined from the past.
Right. Calvinist theologians seem to be more concerned with coming up with an account that gives its due to divine sovereignty, whereas philosophers who tend to be more aware of more concerned with moral responsibility and aware of the conditions under which moral responsibility would be possible, and less concerned with divine sovereignty, then tend to go for a robust conception of free will.
Yeah, and so again, you have these tensions. You have this in non-theological areas, whether you increase the robustness of free will, and therefore you have to have some kind of an indeterministic, and you have to tinker with the physical world so it's not so deterministic, or you degrade free will so you can have a scientific so-called, and the same thing is true in theology. And
I think one of the really interesting things you find when you look at some of these problems with God in the mix is that there are parallel problems that don't involve God at all. So though the threat from universal causal determinism was not a serious philosophical concern until the early modern period.
Because of scientific knowledge.
Because of scientific knowledge and what people thought that scientific knowledge presupposed about the world. You find parallel problems when you go back to early theological discussions of divine sovereignty and
Versus
divine
predestination.
foreknowledge. Exactly.
Right.
So what space can we find for free will if God foreknows the future in exhaustive detail?
This is
working that out is gonna parallel the way people try to work out a space for free will in the context of causal determinism.
And in one case, it's God's absolute sovereignty of the world, God's providence determining. In the other, it's the scientific sequence of causation. But they're both coming to the same element that the world is fixed.
And so it pretty much throws up the same problems for human beings in either case.
Right. So how do you deal with it from a philosophy of religion point of view? How do you deal with that problem? If God knows the future, how do you have libertarian free will, where I don't have the illusion of free will, I really have free will?
Right. I think first of all that this is a way of getting at issues in human free will that you could try to get at without God, but when you introduce God into the mix, it makes the issues more extreme, so they're easier to see. In a way, I'm following a key move that Plato made in his Republic, where he starts off by asking, having the question, why be moral? We can get away with being immoral come up. And Socrates, once the problem is on the table, Socrates says, well, it's kind of hard to look at souls, justice, in an individual soul. They're so small. But notice there are these parallels with the state, the community as a whole. We can raise questions about justice in the community just as we can raise questions about justice in the soul. But the state is so much bigger. Maybe it'll be easier to see justice if we can find it in the state. And another very different example would be the implications of general relativity make very little discernible difference at the local level. You need vast distances and masses exercising huge gravitational forces. And an important empirical confirmation of the general theory of relativity is when during an eclipse, I think in 1919, they were able to confirm that starlight was bent around the sun in just the way Einstein had predicted. So you bring the sun in, this massive body, and then suddenly you've got a difference that might not have been otherwise detected. I think introducing God into the question of free will is like introducing the sun in there. Something that might not otherwise have been detectable suddenly becomes evident. And it happens in the case of God because of the divine excellences. God is supposed to have the sorts of qualities that human beings have, but to the nth degree. And so
that's like a magnifying glass.
Like a magnifying glass, right? So human agency reflects the effectiveness of human agency reflects our power and our knowledge. God is supposed to be the maximally effective agent. Why would that be? Well, he has maximal knowledge. He's omniscient. He has maximal power. He's omnipotent. And so problems in human agency, understanding what effective agency is, and that would include free agency, are going to be writ large, as Plato says, when you look at those problems in the context of divine agency.